Well, Zachary Taylor ended up influencing Lincoln in a couple different respects. So one, we have to remember that Lincoln began his political career as a Whig. And Lincoln had a total of 2 years in Congress. That's his experience with the federal government before he becomes president. But those 2 years turned out to be pretty central or critical because, for one thing, they're going to coincide later a little bit with Taylor. And when Taylor dies, Lincoln's going to give the eulogy. Lincoln really revered Taylor first as a general. He'd been a successful general in Mexico. And one of the things that Lincoln really loved about Lincoln loved about Taylor's general was he would always be able to figure out a way to win against the odds. And this is something you might want to think about is for Lincoln later. He loved the idea that somehow Taylor was always able to figure out a way to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. He loved his his ability to improvise, his ability to sort of be behind enemy lines sometimes and figure out a way to prevail. So he talks about that in the eulogy. And then later, right when Lincoln is about to become president, he writes a letter to some supporters basically saying to them, well, if I've got anybody to credit for my political education at all, it's going to be Zachary Taylor. And it's partly because when Taylor was president, he ended up not doing political parties' bidding. He ended up again trying to be his own man. He created the idea of triangulation, the idea of sort of, I'm not going to be president of my party, I'm not going to do what Congress wants, and he somehow creates this sort of triangle where Taylor's really trying to sort of be president in his own right and to demand dictate to Congress what it does. Lincoln liked that. Lincoln actually thought that was a good thing. And lastly, the policy, Taylor had only one policy of president. It's kind of remarkable. He was president for 15 months. He had literally only one policy. But it was a critical policy. It was he wanted two anti-slavery territories admitted to the Union. One was New Mexico, the other was California. And so he came into office and he said, here's what I demand. Admit these as states, one after the other. Congress didn't want to do that because it would have tipped the balance of power in the favor of anti-slavery forces. Congress at that point was perfectly balanced between the two. And Taylor would have been happy to tip that balance. He demanded it be tipped. Congress said no, and Lincoln had to then respond by being innovative. Lincoln loved all that. I think he really took a lot of lessons from that.
And you say Lincoln was also influenced by Taylor's views on recess appointments.
Right. And so then what happens is after Congress resists what Taylor wants, and the Senate doesn't act on any of his nominations, does that sound familiar? What then happens is Taylor then turns to his Attorney General and says, let's think about recess appointments. And they do. They issue an opinion on, he has his Attorney General issue an opinion on recess appointments, taking a very aggressive stance. He actually makes over 400 of them. And that's a record, of course, at the time. Pretty much a record almost for all time. And Lincoln sees that as a good thing. His Attorney General is going to sign off on the very same philosophy. And it's a very robust view, which the Supreme Court has largely confirmed, and that is that anything can count as a recess. Any break in Congress will count as a recess, and a president can use that time to make an appointment. It doesn't work for President Obama because the court's going to say that turns out not to have been a break. But otherwise, if there is a break, a president can use it to make a recess appointment, and that viewpoint really gets its fullest articulation from Taylor in the 19th century.
It was fascinating to see how deep the conflict over recess appointments stretches into 19th century history. Is the recent Supreme Court decision faithful to that history?
I think it is, yes, except for the fact that it's a judicial intervention. So throughout the 19th century, of course, the court was peripheral to this. The court wasn't a player. People didn't take their disputes oftentimes to the court. Sometimes they did, but not often.